he loves our kids more than we do.
Mm-hmm.
He's more committed to our children than we are. And where were you when you were 17? Often we just need to remember that and remember who God is, remember who we are, and then just have really deep gratitude for how kind God has been in letting us do so much, and just be amazed at that. And then if our 17, 18, 19-year-old, you see all the places they need to be improving, you think, yeah, well, but look how far we've come.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for classical homeschooling mamas who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. Scholé Sisters discusses topics that matter to those of us who believe that educating ourselves through reading widely, thinking deeply, and applying faithfully equips us for the task of educating our children. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can come study Charlotte Mason with me over in the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-host today is Misty Winkler. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 2 graduates. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, now available on Amazon. Our guest today is Toby Sumpter. Toby pastors King Cross Church in Moscow, Idaho. He and his wife Jenny have been married over 20 years and they have 4 kids, one of whom has recently flown the coop. He is a co-host of the CrossPolitic Show and author of Blood-Bought World and No Mere Mortals. He holds a Master of Arts in Theological Studies with an emphasis in church history, and he teaches high school civics at Logos School. Have you joined the Scholé Sistership yet? In January, we kicked off our annual 5x5 reading challenge. It's not too late to join us. All you have to do is head on over to scholésisters.com/join and sign up for the Sophie plan. In addition to a replay of our kickoff webinar, you'll get tons of accountability, book ideas, and support. That's scholésisters.com/join. Today's episode is a little different because it's not focused on doing the homeschool project well, but rather on ending it well. Most importantly, how do we let our sons go when holding on feels so important? You're going to love this conversation, and so without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé every day. Misty, why don't you go first and show us the ropes?
Yes. Well, I am bringing a book I just finished for one of my local book clubs. We read How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture by Francis Schaeffer. And I had already read it before, but it had been a number of years. And it's just so good. I mean, Schaeffer is very idiosyncratic.
True.
You probably know if you've ever seen a picture of him. But almost everyone at the book club said, I am reading this with my teenagers next, which is how I read it with, I think, my oldest. I know I assigned it to both my older boys, and I forget one of them. I actually read it with them and talked through it in 7th grade. But it is like he starts with ancient times and it goes through and gives a history of culture and art and thought. What makes it different from something like Carl Trueman's latest book is that he includes a lot more of the art and culture side. And then it's just a lot more personal. It's his personal voice. It's like someone's talking to you. It's not like an objective reporter approach.
Well, Truman is very academic.
Yes. Yes.
Plus he's British, so he wants to hold you at arm's length.
I think that's what made Francis Schaeffer so many people were really, really impacted by his life. And I think part of it really was his personal nature. I mean, he and his wife did L'Abri for a number of years.
Yeah.
Where they welcomed people into their home. And I think a lot of what went into that book was also like conversations that he'd had with many people over many years.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to just read, I'm going to string together a couple different parts here. Schaeffer is writing this in 1976. So I think a lot of the people he's ministering to are coming out of like the drug culture and the like university riot type situation. He says here, as the more Christian dominated consensus weakened, the majority of people adopted two impoverished values: personal peace and affluence. Personal peace means just to be let alone, not to be troubled by the troubles of other people, whether across the world or across the city. To live one's life with minimal possibilities of being personally disturbed. Personal peace means wanting to have my personal life pattern undisturbed in my lifetime, regardless of what the result will be in the lifetimes of my children and grandchildren. Affluence means an overwhelming and ever-increasing prosperity, a life made up of things, and more things, a success judged by an ever higher level of material abundance. And then he says, after the turmoil of the 1960s, many people thought it was so much better when the universities quieted down in the early 1970s. I could have wept. The young people had been right in their analysis, though wrong in their solutions. How much worse when many gave up hope and simply accepted the same values as their parents: personal peace and affluence. Now drugs remain, but only in parallel to the older generation's alcohol, and an excessive use of alcohol has become a problem among the young people as well. Promiscuous sex and bisexuality remain, but only in parallel to the older generation's adultery. In other words, as the young people revolted against their parents, they came around in a big circle and often ended an inch lower, with the only same two impoverished values: their own kind of personal peace and their own kind of affluence.
Wow.
Yeah.
Here we are, still doing it.
Still cycling.
I feel like we're about a foot lower, at least, if not 10 feet lower.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, Pastor Toby, would you like to go next?
Sure. I have my confession is I sort of decided to go with, I actually decided this, I think right when Misty told me that I had to come up with a book. So I've been planning to commit this sin for a month now. But, it's not really a sin, but my book, quote unquote book, is actually an author. So I'm on a John Buchan jag.
Ooh, I love him.
right now. And I guess part of it, my confession is here I am, I'm 42 and I've never read John Buchan before, to my great shame. And I've heard about him, known about him vaguely for many years. I think I might have read a short story of his in college at New St. Andrews, but never read him. Anyways, over Christmas, picked up one of his early novels, Prester John.
Oh, yeah. Burned
through it, just loved it. So then I kind of was like a vampire looking for more John Buchan. And I found on eBay actually this really cool new printing, this folio set, hardbound, and a five volume box set with some really cool illustrations. The Richard Hannay series, beginning with 39 Steps.
Yeah.
And so good.
So I gave myself a late Christmas present. I told my wife.
Maybe it's early for next year.
Yeah, maybe so. So I read Prester John. I've read 39 Steps, Mr. Standfast. Green Mantle, and now I'm in the third volume, which is Mr. Standfast. And then, if that weren't enough, actually, just sort of, I usually have an Audible book going. A lot of times, my lunch breaks, I plug in and I just listen to something. And I've been listening to a biography of John Buchan by his granddaughter.
Oh, wow.
So her name is Ursula Buchan, and it's called Beyond the 39 Steps. And I'm nearly finished with that, but I didn't bring any quotes with me. But for a little bit for your listeners, John Buchan is a son of a Scottish Presbyterian pastor, a very devout Christian man. And John was also likewise a believing Christian, a devout man, but something of a Renaissance man. He went to South Africa for a bit. He was a historian. He served in Parliament in England. He actually wrote 34 volumes on World War I.
What?
Oh, wow.
He was basically the director of the British news agency, kind of the founding member of the British news agency, hired by British government to combat German propaganda during World War I. And but he's most famous for being basically the godfather of the modern spy thriller novel. Like I forget the guy's name who wrote James Bond stories, but he credits John Buchan as the one who kind of gave him the idea of James Bond.
Oh, wow.
So they're not like really deep novels, but they're very fun novels, but they're written at a time and by a mind that's, I mean, he's just a very intelligent man. I find myself enjoying the process of a really, relatively light-hearted, kind of mystery thriller story while having to look up words about every other page. There's something about that that's just actually really thrilling. So I feel like I'm getting a little bit smarter as I go along, while at the same time just having fun. And then, one other cool thing is Mr. Standfast, the title of the third book. Of course, that's taken from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
Right.
And that book is actually, I'm only about halfway through it, so I don't even know the ending yet and exactly how it all weaves together. But in that book in particular, the Pilgrim's Progress plays a relatively prominent role. So it's not just the name of the book, but he's working with undercover agents, and they have agreed upon the Pilgrim's Progress as being basically their source book for sending coded messages back and forth. and so they refer to, the Wicket Gate and various places and challenges in Pilgrim's Progress to refer to various challenges and steps along the way of their adventure. So anyways, I recommend John Buchan for both literary fun and a little bit of, biblical and literary allusion as well.
That's fun. Brandy's probably read them aloud. I haven't read them. I've only purchased them for my boys.
Yeah.
I've read just the Richard Hannay novels aloud. Yes. And they're so fun.
Yeah.
I love what you said. I'm like, it'll make you smarter, but not too much smarter.
Right. They're still light enough just to be
right.
fun.
That's right. Well, I finally am bringing a respectable book to the table. I feel like I keep bringing these fluffy things and being shamed by others. But today I'm reading Moralia, Volume 1 by Plutarch. I actually, speaking of after Christmas gifts to ourselves, I had a gift card and I spent it on Volume 1, which from the Loeb Classical Library, the little green books.
Those are pretty books.
They are. And I'm hoping that it has friends eventually someday. But the reason why I saved it for this episode, because I've been reading it since January, but I saved it for this episode because the first section is on the education of children. And there's actually a debate over whether or not Plutarch actually wrote this. But it talks about adolescence, raising boys. Like there's a lot in this. And some of it, I don't know. I was wondering if it would even come up today. So I'm going to read a little quote too. Let me see. He says, while it is true that they have put attendants and teachers in charge of their children, I think he means parents here. I didn't go up far enough to figure this out, but they nevertheless have allowed the impetuosity of Ruth to range unrestrained, when they ought, on the contrary, to have exercised greater caution and watchfulness over them when they were young men than when they were children. For who is not aware that the faults of children are trivial and altogether corrigible, heedlessness perhaps towards their attendants, or deceiving and refusing to mind their teachers? But the iniquities of early manhood are often monstrous and wicked. Unlimited gluttony, theft of parents' money, gambling, revels, drinking bouts, love affairs with young girls, and corruption of married women. The impulses of young men should therefore be kept fettered and restrained by careful supervision. And I was like, I see his point, but I'm curious how this dovetails with today, because anyway, we'll see where it goes. But it was just interesting.
Well, do you know what ages he's actually thinking about there?
I am assuming he means before the age of 20, just because of other things I've read, but he doesn't ever define it, so I don't know for sure. But I think he's talking about young unmarried men, and they didn't wait too long to get married. Like they married in their early 20s. So I'm thinking that it had to be, probably late teens. Anyway, it was just an interesting quote. The other thing that has fascinated me with this, there's basically, he wrote a number of, I guess they're essays, I guess we'd call them. Anyway, so there's, I think 3, maybe 4 in this one. So I'm reading the one on how the young man should study poetry right now, which is basically Homer, but it has a few other minor poets in there. I had forgotten about how he wasn't I don't want to say he wasn't a huge fan of Homer, but he took objections to how Homer portrayed the gods. And it's just been fascinating because it's kind of like he has this standard for what a god, or even I would say what capital G God should be. He almost sounds like a monotheist in how he talks. And then he teaches them how to judge whether or not what Homer is saying is true based upon whether or not what he says about the gods conform to this external definition of God that he has. So it's just been super interesting because, he doesn't like how, Zeus does these things or this God does these things that are just so human, fallible, stupid. And he's basically like, that obviously couldn't be true, is his objection. So anyway, it's just kind of a fascinating thing to watch him kind of squirm and try to get around the difficulties of this type of polytheism. It's amusing. Yeah. So anyway, it's been fun.
Hello, Abby here to tell you about Sistership, the place for moms learning and growing. We embrace the call to shape culture by starting with our own education, our own library shelves, and thinking and planning how to spend our time. We need to be equipped for the great task of educating our children. Sistership is the place to talk about reading widely, a place to discuss and think deeply, and share how you are faithfully applying the ideas you encounter. Sistership is for all the women serious about education for themselves and for their families, but understand that in order to educate, we can't take ourselves too seriously. Join us in Sistership for the camaraderie and stay for the fun.
We invited you, Pastor Toby, here today because we wanted to talk about raising really like teenage sons that are in the older teens, ready to leave home kind of situation.
Yeah.
This is mainly listened to by moms, usually homeschool moms, actually. And we're naturally wired and gifted at growing and building families. And sometimes then the teen years are hard because not so much because our kids are difficult, but because we're not really prepared for the next stage of family growth that's requiring us to back off, let go, maybe be less involved. We often think letting go happens when they get married or when they're 18 or 20. And so we're wanting to hold on to this family that we've poured ourselves into for as long as we can. But sometimes that causes difficulty with older teens because we're still kind of grasping.
Yeah.
In the context, we're living in this culture that expects irresponsibility, immaturity into the 20s. So I guess our first question is, or our general topic even is, how can mothers help their children, particularly sons, become real young adults as they hit, 16, 17, 18, they're still at home. All of them are still at home at that age. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me on. And so our oldest, I don't know if how you'll include my kids in the bio or introducing me or whatever, but our oldest is 18 and he moved out last August and he's doing great. He's a freshman here at New St. Andrews College and way, way more mature than I ever was at his age. And I'm really, really grateful. And then I have 2 teenage daughters, 16 and 14. And then my younger son is 11. So I want to just frame what I have to say in sort of that context, which is, we've got one launched and a couple more nearly there. My 16-year-old daughter, yesterday, I went and picked her up from school. She goes to Logos school here and she got her driver's license. And,
exciting.
Then I had her take me home for me to get my truck. And I watched her get in her car and drive away all by herself. And it was just like the weirdest thing. And I think particularly like when my son did it, I think he might have even done it right before he was 16. You can actually get your license here when you're 15.
Oh,
And
wow.
I think he was just shortly before his 16th birthday, but I didn't have nearly the same feelings about him at all. I love him, but like it was like, go, like, drive away. and with my daughter, it was like, where are you going?
Why are you leaving me?
Yeah, and she was just driving back to school. That's all. all wrong. And so last night at dinner time, I was talking to my daughter right below her, who's 14, almost 15, and she's like, Dad, I can start doing driver's ed now. And I'm telling her, no.
So you're saying dads want to hold on too?
Yeah. Especially to our daughters, I think.
Yeah.
One of the things that my wife and I have done since our kids were really little is we've talked with our kids about leaving from when they were really little, and particularly our boys. And we've made a distinction between our sons and our daughters, and we want our daughters to grow up into maturity as well. And that could mean them leaving home at some point, but they know they're aiming to be married and be wives and mothers. Mm-hmm. But we talked with them about our boys leaving since they were little. And so I think that's been one thing that I think for my wife and I, we talk with them about it. We affirm the goodness of it. We don't want, we've basically our house, wouldn't call it a rule, but like our expectation has been, finish high school. And if you'd like to stay for another year, feel free. And then after that, it's sort of a, year by year, we'd be willing to negotiate, but we're leaning on you to be heading out.
Yeah.
Has been our general house expectation. And, with all kinds of reasonable expectation, we talk about needs and, things that came up, but nevertheless wanted them to know, basically our expectation is you're leaving. That's the plan. And we make fun of the 27-year-old who lives in the basement and plays video games all day long. That they know what we think of those kinds of schlubs. And so that's something we've talked about for a long time. I think that's helped. I also think that probably one of the important things that I would say, talking to mostly moms here, would be my wife has talked to me about it a lot. And so I would encourage, talk to your husband a lot. Talk to your husband about it and welcome his leadership. And, there have been points along the way where I've just made some calls that are, they're judgment calls, or not thus says the Lord kind of things, but wanting to aim at this. And so one example, just a little thing was, I think probably, well, actually, let me back up. Let me say one other thing first, and then I'll get to that specific thing. And that is, we've also said, and I got this from Pastor Doug Wilson years ago, and I think he mentions it in some of his, maybe in one of his parenting books, or maybe in a few different places, that he had wanted to raise his children such that when they got to kind of mid-teenage years, before they've left the house and while they're still in the house, having a conversation with his kids, each of them, and I think he did this with each of them and at different points, and basically sat them down and said, I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, you can do whatever you want now. Mm-hmm. I think he's talked about this specifically with his oldest daughter, Becca, who's Becca Merkel now, but when she was, 16 or something, and said, as far as I'm concerned, you can do whatever you want. You can watch any movie you want, go out, whenever you want, however you want, just basically honor God and, please honor your mom and I while you're still here in the home. But I trust you. You're a Christian woman, and I know that you love what God loves, and I know that you're going to make wise choices. And so you're free. It was a really radical thing because, even being around some other Christian families and so on, it was like almost just the opposite. A lot of her peers were getting more and more rules. Mm-hmm. Because as, Plutarch points out, particularly about young men, now that you're 16, you can do real damage.
Yeah.
It's, I forget the word he used, but, when they're little, it's cute.
Yeah.
And when they're older, they can get someone pregnant,
Yeah.
break the law, end up in prison. The stakes are high. And what happens is far too many parents, I think if I understood the Plutarch quote, I'm not sure exactly what he thinks you ought to do when they're young, but I think many parents make mistakes by going light when they're young, going easy when they're young. And then suddenly when it occurs to them, oh my goodness, they could end up in jail. They could get someone pregnant. Then they start trying to clamp down, and it never works.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work, and it just creates all kinds of friction and tension. And so Proverbs says that if you train up a child in the way that he shall go, then when he's old, he will not depart from it. And the reason he won't depart from it is not because you have so many rules.
That's a good point.
The reason he won't depart from it is because he loves what you gave him. He loves the standard. And this is another Pastor Dougism, but he says, we don't want to raise our children merely to submit to the standard. We want to raise our children to love the standard. And that's why when we told our kids that we were going to do that when they were little, we said, there's going to come a time, probably sometime in your late teen years before you leave the home, and we're going to sit you down and we're going to tell you that you're free. Honor God, honor your mom, honor me, but you can basically do whatever you want, with a handful of, sort of household rules in place, but basically you can do what you want. And if it's not breaking God's laws, then, no worries. I did that with my son when I think he was about 16. I think he was a junior in high school, and, he was free to make the decisions he wanted to make and go where he wants to go. And I told my wife just on maybe it was Sunday. I haven't actually had this conversation with my daughter yet, but I told her on Sunday, I'm going to have that conversation with Felicity. She's the one that just turned 16 or just got her license. I said, as soon as she gets her license, I'm going to have that conversation with her. We actually kind of started the conversation in the car together, I think on Sunday. And we said, I might have a few more pointers for you as my daughter. I'd like to know a little bit more about where you are at night, and, and please make sure that you're with a friend and don't be by yourself. And, there'll be a few things.
Okay, I was going to ask about that. Like some of the safety, I need to know where to look for you if I think you're in a ditch.
And I think particularly for my daughter, there's going to be a little bit more of that. My son's a, 6'3", 220 pound,
so you're less concerned.
I'm more concerned about other people than I am for him. But
that's fair.
And obviously there's also some blessings of modern technology with, we've got cell phones and we have a, family app that we're all on where you can actually open it up and see where is everybody. I'll occasionally get a text from my wife as I get home, welcome home, Oh, thanks. You're following me.
Okay. Can I ask a question about tech? Because that's a huge thing in families, is trying to figure out how to navigate when kids get phones or use computers or that kind of thing. So did you have principles that you were using to make those decisions? Because presumably they didn't just materialize with a phone at 17 or something, that there was something that preceded that. Right.
No. So we were very, very careful with screens and technology in our house. But what I wanted to do was, and I don't remember the exact age my son was when he got a phone. We had, like a dumb phone.
Right. Yeah.
That we didn't, at some point we didn't have a landline anymore. So we wanted something at the house for the kids when they were there. And it was just a dumb phone. And so he could have that occasionally, and would, if he was going somewhere, he'd occasionally throw that in the backpack in case he needed to call and get picked up or something. I think it was probably around the same time I had that conversation with him that he got a cell phone, and I think he got a smartphone. But my goal was I wanted him to have it while he was still in my home.
Yeah.
So that there was a year or two where there was still some checks on it and accountability. But we had been talking about screens and technology since he was young. All our computers and TVs and stuff are out in public eye. And we had an iPad that we had as a family, that we'd take on car trips and things like that. But, the family policy was you don't take the iPad back to your bedroom. You don't take it back off by yourself. If you have permission to use it, you're using it here in the living room where everyone else is. And I talked to my boys from when they were young, particularly about the dangers of sexual temptations. My son was probably 3 and 4. I was already talking to him. I just used the language of the bad lady. That was my translation of Proverbs.
Yeah.
I just told him, I said, you have to watch out for the bad lady. And we would talk about how God made men and women different and beautiful. A woman is beautiful. That's her glory. And it's to be honored. It's to be protected. But the bad lady wants to try to use her beauty to trick you. And so, from early times, we practiced, if we I taught them if an immodest woman came up on a screen or commercial, we looked away, that kind of thing. There was a lot of teaching and training for many years. And then, as we have whatever, we talk about it with family, entertainment, we're watching movies. So there's, there's screen there, there's an iPad or whatever. So there's a lot of practice going on for a long time before he gets handed a phone. And again, it was about the same time I think he got his driver's license. But at that point, you figure, well, he's driving. There's life and death things going on there, and so you need to be making wise decisions at the wheel. And yes, I'm going to give you this other tool that can be really useful, but also there's life and death in this little phone.
Yeah.
And so we talked a lot about that over the last, the couple of years he was still in the home and before he left. But yeah, that's been our practice. And I think my teenage daughters now, they have phones. My younger one, I think I did this actually with my son when maybe this is for like the first 6 months or year or so. There were some like parental locks and restrictions on it. And then I took them off after about a year. And so my older daughter has her phone and some instructions and directions that she follows. My younger daughter has a phone with restrictions still on it for now. And a lot of conversations and talking about that. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. Except that I'm wondering, did you have any specific advice about things like social media? And I'm thinking specifically of some of the stuff that goes on with kids and photos.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot. I say the big thing is just, a lot of conversation. And I think this is broadly probably just an important theme for teenagers in general, is we talk a lot. Dinner time is a long drawn, it's frequently long and hilarious and fun. And, it's, an hour later and then somebody's like, oh, I've got homework but we talk a lot. My wife is also, I'm really, really grateful for her in particular, because I'm the oldest of 5 boys and a girl, which means that I didn't know how to carry on a conversation until I met my wife. We still laugh because my wife, one of the first times we met in high school, and I wouldn't repeat this exactly the same way, but we didn't know about courtship and this sort of thing. But she went on a sort of a family movie outing with my family one time, and she looks back and she laughs about it because she grew up. She's the oldest of 3 girls, so they just thought it was the opposite, But she said we drove to the movie theater and there was the radio was on. All she remembered was the radio was on and nobody said anything for 30 minutes. and she thought we were a family of psychos. And it was only later that I explained to her that there was a baseball game on the radio that we were all listening to, which I'm not sure actually helped. He's like, so you are psychos. But my wife has actually been a tremendous gift in just learning to be a good conversationalist. And she's really wonderful. And I think this is something that, frequently God's made women to be better with words, quicker with words, better conversationalists. And she's really good at drawing my kids out in a really helpful way. And I think as they hit their teen years, I think just making a shift to being, there's still the authority in place, but you really do have to start practicing a kind of a friendship. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, yes, the authority's there and there's still a place for teaching and instructing and correcting, but you've got to converse with them in a way like their friend and begin to draw them out. What are you thinking about that? And so we do a lot of that with the social media stuff, though. where, we've talked a lot about, what is appropriate to post, what not to post. You don't want to be raising Pharisees who look at everyone else and thank God I'm not like that.
Right.
That's one problem. But the father in Proverbs does point particular people out to his sons.
Yeah.
And says, do you see what they're doing? Don't do that. Mm-hmm. And so we do that. We try to balance that with, now, don't think the worst about them. Don't think you're better. It's all grace. But nevertheless, do you see what they're doing there? Is that wise? What do you think? And we talk about it. You talk about it enough, and then they start bringing some of them up themselves. They'll say, Dad, so-and-so posted this. What do you think? And, oh, well, what do you think? Let's talk about it. And so I don't think I think for the, I think it's hard to keep track of where each one of them is, but I'm pretty sure that I don't think my son had any social media till maybe like a year or so ago. And I think initially he only got Facebook so he could play his mom. There's like a Scrabble game using Facebook,
right,
like that. And so he never did anything with it other than just play Scrabble with his mom. And then, maybe eventually he's using it a little bit. And then we've talked with our daughters. I think they both now have Instagram, but we've talked quite a bit about that. And there've been a couple times where we've talked about, like, who do you follow and who do you friend and why are you following them? And thinking through that, like, what does it mean to follow them? My younger daughter she's a twin. Her twin actually died in my wife's pregnancy. And so my daughter it's sort of a special part of her identity that she knows that she has a twin who's with the Lord. And so that's been one of the things that she's been fascinated with all her life is twins. It's found a few, I guess, sort of like, I don't know what you call them, like celebrity twins or, I don't know, that kind of thing. And, and I think most of them have been Christians or something, relatively conservative, but still kind of talking to her about, okay, you're into that, but are you, make sure you're being thoughtful there. And just because they're Christian doesn't mean that, everything they say, do, or think is cool is actually good. So, but I would just say a lot of conversations, occasional, little course corrections of, let's not follow that one, or let's not do that. I think they all have a very relatively conservative sense of, like, pretty cautious about what they would particularly post. And because I think we've, how much we've talked about it.
Yeah. I know that your oldest is already out of the house, but I mean, since you're giving your children so much freedom starting around age 16, I think you could still help us get an answer to this question. We have a number of, even people involved in Scholé Sisters on the staff level who are going to have this situation where we have Misty has an adult child living at home, actually, come to think of it.
Basically, yep.
So adult children living at home. So they're attending tech school, they're attending a local college. They have good reason for still being at home. Mm-hmm. But there's that balance that we're all trying to have where we don't want to baby these children, but they do have to be considerate of, like the other people who live in the house. Yeah. And there's this idea of if they were living on their own, they'd have to contribute to that household. So it's a very logistical, and I know it can be a very individual sort of thing, but like, do you have basic principles or anything? I know, because you also have worked with lots of college kids just from where you are, that were like, you can give advice to moms who are saying, like, they kind of want their son to still do the dishes, like that kind of stuff, but yet they don't want to be treating them like they're still 10.
Right.
So how do we navigate that kind of situation?
Yes. Yeah. Good luck.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Well, so I was going to mention this earlier as I was leading up to that kind of freedom thing, but I remember with my son, one of the things I did, and again, I think sort of more of a principle than this is the way to do it. But I think when he was about somewhere around 13 or 14, one day, I just told my wife that she couldn't say anything to my son anymore about what he ate. And you're laughing, so I guess you understand.
Yeah, we do. We do.
I don't know what my sons eat. I haven't since they were 16. Okay, I don't know. They're still alive. So
well, it was not like a big deal at all. It was just like, oh, okay. But I just noticed there was still sort of this, like, mothering instinct of like, eat your vegetables, or, you didn't finish everything, or what did you eat for breakfast? And I totally get it. And I love it because it's glorious. You mothers keep our children alive, and it's wonderful. And at the same time, I realized that around that 13, 14-year age, what I was concerned about happening was I didn't want their relationship to have any tension over that. And I knew that at this point, he's 13 or 14, he's going to do what he wants to do. He's been trained. He basically knows what's healthy. He basically knows what's polite. And I still pull him aside from time to time, or I did at that point. I haven't for years now, but I would still pull him aside from time to time and say, please remember to honor your mom at dinner. Please remember to honor her. But I told her on the other side, I said, I don't want you to say anything about what he eats or doesn't eat anymore. And I said, the reason is you have she had and she has a very, very sweet relationship with him. And I just didn't want there to be any tension there at all.
Yeah.
And I knew that as a young man, he wanted more and more freedom. And it's a really easy place to sort of, in principle, give him it. And that was even, before we had the conversation with him that said, hey, you can do whatever you want. It was just a place where I kind of wanted to just put a marker down for both my son and my wife that he's leaving and he's going to be making these decisions on his own. So I want you to think that way about him. And then, of course, I wanted him to rise to that occasion too, which he did. Not perfectly. And there were certainly times where, you're looking at what he's eating and you're thinking, dear Lord, please spare his life, whatever. It works out. So that's just like a kind of a principle thing. And I think it's that kind of thing, though, where I would say, yes, you're absolutely right. And I remember this even just, a senior year of high school with our son River, because he was crazy busy finishing high school, all kinds of after school activities and, working, several part-time jobs and all the rest of it. And then, his bedroom would sometimes look like a bomb went off in it. And Jenny comes to me and, I don't know if he's done any laundry in like 2 weeks, or whatever. And, what do you want me to do? And I don't know that we ever really arrived at like the perfect system, but the principle was I really, really didn't want my wife nagging her son.
Yeah.
And I really wanted us to have sort of an agreed upon plan. Like you said, college students have to have some kind of living arrangements. And there's certain things that are just, acceptable or not acceptable, sort of bare minimums. And I would honestly say, if you're in that situation where you have a grown son who is staying with you for good reasons for a period of time, I would basically, without being weird about it, I would treat it relatively formally, like, here's the agreement, son. And again, I don't know that you have to like put it in writing necessarily, although that could be helpful. I don't know. But I would sit down at like the beginning of the year or at some point and just say, we want to respect you. You're an adult. We don't want to mother you. We don't want to nag you at all. We want to have a good working relationship with you. And so just like any other living arrangement, here are sort of the bare minimum. And I would just list it out. If you want him, if he still needs to do dishes one night a week, well then, which night would you like to be your dishes night? My son moved out in August and he's in a house with 10 guys here in town.
Wow.
But the ringleader of the guys is he's a drill sergeant, and he's only 20 years old, but he's just sort of like, he's doing a great job. But he, had a house meeting at the beginning of the year and told them all, like, look, we're not going to live like a bunch of slobs. We're going to be Christian men. We're going to pick up after ourselves. And, here are basically the house rules. And, there's like every week there's a room check. They have a rotation on, bathroom cleaning. And then they're paired in teams where they have an assigned night of the week where they make dinner for anyone that's there. And that includes cleaning up the kitchen when you're done.
Nice.
So, if 10 guys can come up with that, then, I think you can have similar house rules. The principle, though, is treat your son like an adult. And so talk it through with your husband, think about it, and then say, okay, what if you had an adult boarder who stayed with you for a year? How would you present it to them? Are any of your house rules that you're trying to insist upon ones that you would feel kind of embarrassed about for a boarder? And you have to brush your teeth by 9:30. Oh yeah. I guess we wouldn't say that to well, then don't say that to your grown son. But if it's, we'd like you to pitch in with the dishes once a week, or we'd like you to, clean one of the bathrooms once a week, those are perfectly reasonable house rules and part of the rent. Speaking of which, I told my son was welcome to stay with us. This is his freshman year of college. And I told him that after he graduated high school, I said, you're welcome to stay on for another year if you like, rent free. And, I think I said something like, there's probably be some household chores to keep up with, but if you'd like to save the money and live here, you're welcome. And initially he said, yeah, I'm probably going to do that, Dad. And then this house kind of came together last minute in August. And, he messaged his mom and I, like, I don't know, right a week before school started, and said, Dad, there's this house that came up. I'm thinking about doing it. And we said, well, it's up to you. Do what you like. And a few days later, he said, I signed the lease. I'm in. And we said, great. But we had also said to him, after that year, we'll talk again. And if you want to stay longer, I was planning on beginning to actually charge a little bit of rent.
Yeah.
And that was just it wasn't going to be much, and it'd probably still be a steal of a deal compared to what he's paying now. But the principle was that I actually wanted that as a way of honoring him.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do him the honor of saying, you're a man now, and I'd like you to contribute to the household's needs in this way, like a man. And again, not that you have to do that, but that's something that I was thinking about. But the principle would be respect. Think of your son as a man. He's a young man. He's not as mature as your husband. He's, and is going to make some mistakes and be immature in certain ways. But I think the real overarching principle is do everything you can as a mom to look up to your son. Think of him as a man. And then wherever you think, I think there's some, correction here, or we need to do something here, I would talk to your husband about how to address it, just knowing that you probably are right about seeing the weakness or the immaturity. The question would be whether or not it should be addressed, or you should let, the Lord address it, or life address it in God's providence.
I like that principle. I've never thought of it as a boarding situation before for some reason, but that helped me a lot because we actually used to have a Japanese exchange student, like a college age exchange student that lived with the family. And so I can think very much about, well, what did we expect of her? What did we not expect of her? I mean, that just actually simplifies it a lot for me.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then it really, once you have that category, then you can actually just sort of almost set it aside. Like that's the formal. And then it actually just frees you all up just then to enjoy each other.
Yeah. That's a great point. Well, and that's what we want, right? I mean, we want them to still have good memories of that period of their lives too, and not have like resentment because they didn't have enough money for rent or something.
Right. Yeah.
Or to want to come for dinner sometimes, not like, oh, and now I have to.
Exactly. Yeah.
And mom's going to ask me if I ate my vegetables.
I'm not going to come to dinner because mom will make me eat a salad.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was thinking about as I was thinking about this conversation was what you want is both, especially for your sons, you want them to love being independent. It's really, really important for them to love that, because that's the prerequisite for them to start their own families.
Right.
If they're not independent, then there's all kinds of question marks about whether they're ready to start their own family. And so in Genesis 2, and it's referred back to by Jesus, in the creation of man, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother. The implication there is learning to be independent. But the flip side of it is that you still want, as you were just saying, you want him to love coming home. You want him to be loyal to his family and really love his mom and dad and his family. And I think we've been really grateful to see this with our son, where, he, I think like the first quarter, we didn't hardly see him at all. And it was just, I think it was all exciting and new. And then about second quarter, we started getting these texts occasionally like, hey, you guys eating dinner tonight? Yeah, we're eating dinner like we do every night.
Every night.
Is there enough for me to come? Oh, sure. Come on over.
Aw.
And he's kind of settled into, like, we see him a little bit more on the weekends. We do a family Sabbath dinner Saturday night, getting ready for the Lord's Day, and he's there for most of those, and we'll occasionally even stay over Saturday night and then go to church with the family. And but you ask him, Jenny just teases him. She'll say, you want to move home, and it, like, without missing a beat, nope. And we love it. Like, it's the perfect balance where he clearly loves being with us. He clearly loves being with his sisters. He loves hanging out with us. And, occasionally he'll even just come over in the evening and just do some studying or whatever. But do you want to come home? Nope. and that's what we want.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So pretend we're in Proverbs. You don't have to name names, but I'm thinking, like, what kinds of, shall I say, mistakes have you seen parents make with their young adults that are kind of like a pattern?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are some of the most excellent things that you've seen? Like, can you kind of, I don't know, give us some hot tips, I guess?
Yeah. Well, some of them I've already noted, but I would just say, I think one of the overarching big patterns would be parents that clamp down or try to clamp down in the teenage years, especially, or even, maybe later on. But I think it's really disrespectful of their kids. And I think boys in particular, but I think it could be that way with daughters too. But, as they're coming into maturity, I think we need to honor that. And as I said before, really respect that. And I think especially in our sons, but I think, again, it applies to our daughters too. They're coming into maturity, and we need to honor them. And so I think what happens is, especially when you see the weaknesses, or you see places where maybe you should have done better, or you didn't address things, the temptation in our flesh is to fear and then grasp for control. But rather than doing that, everything we do as Christians is by faith, and that includes parenting. And so that means that when we see the weakness, or we see something that we know needs to be addressed, we need to start by believing God. We need to believe him that he is for us and not against us, and thank him for this moment, thank him for this opportunity. And then I would say, given where they are, if they're 2 or they're 4, well, then you graciously, cheerfully, haul them off to the woodshed and show them some love that way. But you can't do that with a 15-year-old. You can't do that with a 17-year-old. And so treat them like your brother or your sister. And that means, I think, again, a lot of conversation, a lot of honor, a lot of respect for who they are, and not clamping down. So, that's sort of a negative and a positive all at the same time. But I think that's been easily one of the most overarching patterns that I've seen. I've seen where parents take the time just to simply love their young adult, honor them, honor what they think, really think through what they think, care about them, think highly enough of them to really discuss things. And that doesn't mean just, letting them say foolish things. I mean, challenge them, respect them enough to have a spirited, respectful debate. That's part of the honor as well, rather than clamping down because you're afraid of what this might mean, or afraid of where they might go. Related would just be, too, I think, not freaking out if your son or daughter says something that's a little off or isn't what you would expect them to say or think. Remembering that, by the same token, they are still young, still immature, and occasionally might say something that's off, or think something that's off, or whatever. And again, trust the Lord that this is from his hand, and thank him for it, and look at it as an opportunity to address something, and trust that since the Lord brought it up for you to address, it must be because he wants you to address it. So you can go into it with a smile on your face. You can go into it with joy in your heart, knowing, oh, this is from the Lord. This is going to be good. And it might be challenging. There might be hard elements to it, but if it's from the Lord, then it's ultimately for our good. And I think lots of conversations, discussions, and a lot of joy. I guess I just think that fellowship in the family is so, so key. That would also include making sure that your home, your family has a real keen sense of anytime there's any bumps or tension between anybody in the family, it's quick confession of sin, quick forgiveness, quick back into fellowship. A family where that's norm, where everybody in the family knows and the teenagers are all in, like they understand in their bones that they love being in fellowship with God and with their family. And sin feels yuck. All sin feels yuck, and they don't like being in any way out of fellowship with one another. That family, it's a huge, huge gift, because whatever comes up, whatever bumps, whatever challenges, whatever, you can deal with all of that far more easily when there's this base level of no backlog of sin, no resentment, no bitterness, no bringing up old stuff or whatever. When everybody's committed to, we forgive the way we've been forgiven, we confess our sins to one another, we forgive, and there's a clean slate, and sins are as far as the east is from the west. When there's that base level, it really is such a gift, because every challenge that then possibly comes up, whether providential hardship or sin or whatever, it really is like, that's all you're dealing with. It's just that. But when you haven't had that kind of when that's not the norm, then every new challenge is sort of on top of all the other old gunk.
Right.
And then the issue is not the issue, because the issue is actually the previous issue, which was built on top of the previous issue, which is, tangled with that other issue. And it's a real snarl. So I think those would be my two big do's and don'ts would be those, really honor and respect your teenagers. Don't clamp down. Think of them as your brother and sister in the Lord. Talk to them that way. Share what you've learned in that way. Encourage them in that way. And of course, from time to time, correct and instruct them, but do it with that basic mindset. And then just keep really, really short accounts, be in fellowship. I think those two things, are really, really monumental as you're sorting through all the particulars of the teenage and young adult years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so tempted to throw a wrench in this. Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Okay. So you say don't clamp down. What happens if you have given a child that you thought was trustworthy that freedom at, say, 16, and at 17, you find out there's been some sort of gross misuse of that freedom?
Yeah.
Alcohol, drugs, sex, whatever.
Right.
I'm assuming don't clamp down still applies. I know you're not going to do like a whole pastoral counseling session with us or anything. And by the way, just for our listeners, this is not an example from my life. Please don't think it is. But I know that we have some people listening who have experienced that. Yeah. And so my question is like, what are the first couple of steps in the process that is not focused on clamping down? Because that is pretty much the knee-jerk response.
Right. When
this happens.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And it happens. And by the way, I'm a pastor, so I do pastoral counseling all the time. And I'm happy to do it right here.
Well, thank you.
I think what I would say, though, is on those things. So once you reach that kind of sin, you deal with your son or your daughter like a brother or sister in the Lord. And so there, I would just, the standard is God's word. The standard is not my house rules or how does this make me feel? The standard is God's word. And so I'll just give an example. This is a relatively common challenge. So let's say, your son turned 16 and he got his driver's license and got his first smartphone, and, you warned him and taught him and thought you'd practice quite a bit and said, be careful. There's some real toxic stuff on here. And, particularly you need to watch out for pornography. And what happens if a year later, you find out, or what, he comes to you or whatever and says, for the last year, Dad, I've been really in porn. It's bad. It's bad. It's been bad. I thought I could deal with it. I didn't. It's bad. I need help. Or you catch him or something, right?
Yeah.
But what I would do is I would treat it actually exactly the same way I would treat another young man who walked into my office. Now, obviously, I'd be more personally invested if it's my own son. But another young man who we have college men here and a bunch of them, and this is a conversation I have to have with many of them. And what does Jesus say? Well, Jesus says that if you've lusted in your heart after a woman who's not your wife, you've committed adultery. And if your hand causes you to sin, you have to cut it off. And if your eye causes you to sin, you have to pluck it out, because it's better to go to heaven missing a hand or an eye than to go to hell with both your hands, both your eyes. And so I say to the young man, this means that in addition to obviously confessing your sin to God, confessing your sin to anyone else that you've directly sinned against, maybe your parents, if you have this trust broken with them, you need to confess it to them, ask for forgiveness. And now, as part of repentance, what are you going to do to cut off that hand and pluck out that eye that's caused you to sin? What needs to be done now? I typically put it in their court and I say, you need to do this. You've got to kill this dragon. What are you going to do to make sure that what Jesus is saying is that you need to take such decisive, even seemingly violent action so that this sin can't happen again?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? And, sometimes I'll brainstorm with them. I said, you get rid of your phone. You could put some accountability software on it. Do you need to cancel your internet? Do you need to change jobs? Do you need to move? Those are the kind of things that Jesus is talking about. What do you want to do? And I'll usually brainstorm with them. And then often what I'll do with young men that come see me is I'll say, tell you what, here's my list of ideas. You need to take decisive action so that if this temptation arises again, you can't do it even if you want to. That's
Nice.
what Jesus says to do.
Yeah.
So why don't you come back next week and I want you to tell me what your plan is. And so long as it's semi-reasonable, I'm going to agree to your plan. And as long as your plan works, then great. And we'll check in periodically and see how your plan's going. But if your plan starts breaking down and it's not working, then I'm going to step in as your pastor and require a few additional things to make sure that you actually stop this. So there's one example, but I would just say in that case, what I'm doing in that situation, whether it's my son or any other young man, is I'm actually respecting him as a man.
Yeah.
And I'm not clamping down in terms of like hovering over him like a parent. Obviously, there's, a parent can do these same steps. But I think the key thing is basically you're pointing into the Bible and saying, this is what Jesus requires. And I love you enough. I'm going to hold you accountable that you do this. And I would just do the same thing with, if a 17-year-old daughter or son is struggling with alcohol or drugs or lying or shoplifting or premarital sex or something like that, I would just do the same thing. We'd walk through the exact same steps and we'd say, this is what the Bible says. This is not me as your mom or dad giving you a house rule per se, but this is me telling you what the Bible requires. And then I would ask them, what are you going to do to make sure this stops, assuming they're repentant and so on? And how can I help you? How can I help hold you accountable? Can we meet once a week? Can we meet once a month? I think the key thing would be really treating them as much as possible as an adult and thinking of them as, again, as a brother or sister in the Lord, a little brother or little sister in the Lord that needs accountability, needs counsel, needs friendship, and needs the word of God brought to bear. So I would consider that just Christian accountability and friendship. Clamping down would, in my book, would be something, would just be simply, I think, throwing a bunch of rules at it to try to make it go away, which is not the same thing as just walking through what does the Bible require in a situation like this, and then looking to them to apply it themselves with accountability in place. Does that answer your question?
That was super helpful. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. I think part of the difficulty as a mom with those teenagers, especially when we are homeschooling and planning out, their whole education, and we've taken that on as our project, that we think that they're going to be at the end of that when they leave. Like it's our job to have them be perfectly ready for life when they leave. And so some of the fear might be, we see all the ways they aren't ready. And so we don't want to let them leave yet.
Right.
And so it's like, yes, we're recognizing they are their own people. God's working in their life apart from us. So we're letting go of that role as like their personal Holy Spirit, what we're not supposed to be.
Yes. You need to do that. I think that's right. And I think the way you put that is actually really helpful, Misty, because I think you're right. I can see that. So my wife homeschooled our daughters a little bit when they were young. We're now in Logos School, the classical Christian school here in town, but she's a teacher now, a fourth grade teacher. And every good teacher is so invested in their kids. And then, times, 1,000 if it's your own kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you are, especially if you homeschool them all the way through, the investment is massive, and you're so invested, and all the planning and you commitment to excellence. And I think you're spot on with the temptation then to think that, you're their personal Holy Spirit when you're not. And then, to have a really hard time letting go when you see all the ways in which, they're not ready. And I guess the thing that I think of is, I think every one of us, if you're honest, stop for a second and think of yourself at 17, So, how were you doing?
Right.
And obviously, we all want our children to stand on our shoulders, want them to be, and by God's grace, improve upon where we were, but stop and think, what was the Lord working with when you were 17 and 18? What kind of grade would you have given yourself? And you really need to I think have a real deep humility without giving up and without lowering, standards of excellence and wanting to pursue that. But I think at the same time, a real deep humility in the fact that, man, we're all such pieces of work, and God has been so kind and gracious to us, and He is the one who's begun a good work in our kids. And I think just remembering too, He cares about our children more than we do. Sometimes but I'm their dad, I'm their mom. No, but right. He loves our kids more than we do.
Mm-hmm.
He's more committed to our children than we are. And where were you when you were 17? Often we just need to remember that, and remember who God is, remember who we are, and then just have really deep gratitude for how kind God has been in letting us do so much, and just be amazed at that. And then if our 17, 18, 19-year-old, is still got work to, you see all the places they need to be improving, you think, but look how far we've come.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, this has been super helpful.
Thank you so much for spending your time doing this with us. I appreciate it so much, more than because I feel like, it's just the stage of life that we're in right now. Right, Misty?
Yeah.
House full of teenagers, and they all want to leave eventually. How dare they?
Yeah. And of course, the goal is I remember there was a pastor, I heard a sermon a while ago, a friend of mine, and it stuck with me that's probably been, I don't know, a decade or more ago. And it was a parenting sermon, and I don't remember anything else except for this one line. But he said, your job is not done until you see your grandchildren walking with the Lord.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of puts it in perspective, because if your goal in raising your children is grandchildren that love Jesus, then you've got to have the launch in view.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you don't get grandkids. So you have to have the launch in view, but it's not an indifferent launch. It's an invested launch. It's a launch that says, that's my goal. My goal is to see my children leave, starting their own families, raising their own children, to love Jesus even more than I ever did. And I think that's, a really glorious perspective.
It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for asking, and great to be having this conversation with you all, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with her. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholésisters.com/SS120 to check it out. Don't forget to sign up for the Scholé Sistership and join the 5x5 Reading Challenge support group. The 5x5 reading challenge really helps you read widely, which is the first step in self-education. Just go to scholésisters.com/join and become a Sophie member. You are not going to believe who we're having on the show next episode. It's David Hicks. I know, I was amazed too. We were thrilled to have a nice long chat with him concerning the ideal type and especially how the ideal type applies to women. I think you'll find this as fascinating as we did. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
All right. Even my microphone all hooked up the way it was supposed to.
Fancy. What will you do with your extra time?